Good morning. Thank you for coming. The weather is forbidding, and it's very heartwarming to see that you couldn't be forbidden to come here. This is a symptom of the health of a church. Thank you for coming. The reason that I chose today's subject matter, February is Black History Month. And Black history really is the history of the world in a very important sense. Because in the rainbow configuration of humanity, the color black or the spectrum of non-white peoples has contributed so enormously to the weave and fabric of humanity. America, for example, the speech, the music, the cuisine, theological ideas, so many contributions have been made by Africans who were either voluntarily making these contributions out of the sheer joy of the discovery or the invention or the creation, or because of forced servitude or enslavement. And yet those contributions are enormous, whether they be forced or voluntary. So, Black History Month. My wife gave me this beautiful dashiki as a gift. In African culture, so much beauty, so much vibrancy, so much life, so much creativity is there. And we like to think that racism is a thing of the past, oppression is a thing of the past, and we are now in a new age free of these blights. Would that it were true. Of course things are better. Some years back I read Frederick Douglass's autobiography. And the things that he had to do to obtain an education and to obtain his freedom, unbelievably bad situation that an African or a person of color was born into 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago, or 400 years ago, here in this land. I want to talk about some of these things. Those of you who know me know that recently I went to Florida to participate in a course in transformative communication and conscious living in order to gather skills that I think will improve my ministry. And one of the things that happened, there's a 3-day intensive that I attended in November, and there's a 7-day intensive I'm going to complete my training with in March that's coming up. So in that 3-day intensive, one of the things that we went over was we played a game that taught what the effect of your consciousness is and the outcome of a project that you involve yourself in. The game involved 2 teams competing with each other, and there were a set of rules that each team had to abide by. And we were told, everyone who participated, there were 32 participants, everyone was told it could be a win-win situation. And here are the rules, here is the objective, go for it. We spent a couple of hours, and it was really kind of intense. Each group was in a different room. And at the end of it, we didn't achieve the win-win. And in my mind, I was thinking, it's not possible to have this win-win. And actually, my contribution to the group was along those lines. I would more or less trot out the reasons why it's not possible to have a win-win. Later, when we assessed how we did as a group, we learned from the people that put on this training that indeed, around the world, several times, there have been teams that, independent of each other, realized how to make a win-win situation. I was astounded at the fact that I was blocking the ability to see a win-win outcome And I contributed to the group dynamic, to the gestalt, something that forbade that outcome. So the first thing in overcoming roadblocks to racial injustice, I think, is essential that we understand that we can do this. It can be done. Without the belief that it can be done, even if you make an effort, that effort will not be perfectly fruitful. It may be fruitful temporarily and to a modest degree. But if we really want to change the world, we really have to deeply, deeply believe in it. I think about some of the evidences of people who deeply, deeply believed. Was not Martin Luther King warned? There's danger. Cease and desist if you want to live a long life, if you want to have peace. And his election was, I have more peace in my soul if I carry on this struggle. And damn the torpedoes, as the saying goes. That is a conviction that is invincible. That's what changes the world. So in order to change the world, you have to believe that it's possible. Now, recently I spoke a lot about belief. And one of the things that I talked about is that people believe things for the utility that the belief affords them. Very often knowing well that what they believe is either unsupported or false, but they believe it nonetheless. And I think it's really important to examine the fact that there's so little that we can know absolutely, but that's not a barrier to going forward and changing the world. Now, one of the things that has fascinated me since I heard about it was the experiment in social therapy or community-based healing that has taken place in Giel, Belgium. I've spoken about this topic in the past here at the church. In Giel, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, clinically insane people have been woven into, embraced by the community, and have become constructive, productive, nonviolent contributors to a vibrant society. Now, if you read the history of Giel, Belgium, it's based on a story about Saint Dymphna. And if you read the story of Dymphna, you may say, as I said, is this true? Is this historical? Or is this a kind of myth that was created by human beings because there are supernatural elements in it that just defy easy acceptance? I say it doesn't matter if it's historical narrative that's being reproduced accurately or myth. The fact that the people in Belgium believed that if they welcomed the insane into their homes as family members, that the insane would become sane and that the community would flourish. And because they deeply believed this, for hundreds and hundreds of years this has taken place. And the report is, and in Europe this has been critically studied by scholars in university, and it has produced dissertations. There's only one scholar in America, she's in Alabama, her name is Goldstein, who has studied this. But over centuries, there have been two instances, I think it's two only, of violent crimes by these criminally insane people. So the first thing that we have to do if we want to create a situation of justice, racial justice, is believe that it can be done, that we can create a society where people are not penalized because of their ethnicity. First point. Another thing that I thought was relevant to overturning racial injustice is we really have to understand how corrosive to the psychology and the emotional well-being of persons who are victimized, systems of victimization are. Now, my wife and I love to talk. It's one of the great joys of our life. We found each other in part because of our gabbiness. We had a goster the day we met for about 2 hours in a parking lot. Just couldn't quit. And then after that, we didn't see each other for 2 years, but we wrote letters, and we still have the pile of letters back and forth. This was pre-internet, so handwritten, page after page. Or she was telling me about Lorenza Andretti Smith. Now, maybe some of you did as we did, go to see her when she was here in Wichita. This is a Methodist minister, and she really took to heart what Bob Marley always wove into his music. Who feels it knows it. Andretti Smith wanted to know what it's like to be homeless, and so she went to the bishop and she said, I would like to sell my possessions, and I would like your permission to live among the homeless for the next 3 years. And the bishop gave his blessings. And she sold her belongings, and she has famously been living under bridges and over grates where there's some warmth on a cold winter's night, and eating with and talking with and traveling with the homeless, and being vamped on, harassed, and troubled by the police and other authorities. So she did that for some years, and guess where she is now? She's in India, living with the homeless there. And the interesting thing that my wife said that I think is really pertinent to overthrowing racial injustice. She said, Andretti has noticed that when she lives among the homeless under the conditions that they suffer, for a few weeks, a certain length of time, her ability to make good decisions about her safety, about her intentions, about her identity, it just diminishes more and more, to the point where she realized, if I don't remove myself from this situation and restore my sanity, my well-being, my clarity, my purpose, I'll perish. What I'm getting at here is that people who were brought here forcibly in the slave trade have been harassed and persecuted and troubled, brutalized in a way that's practically inconceivable. And there's no respite. There is no respite often enough. You read a story like Native Son by Richard Wright. Oh, it's a difficult read. I've read it more than once. It's a difficult read. You read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And these are difficult reads because they chronicle the brutalization, the assault, the affliction that the system of racism and segregation and Jim Crow has visited on black and colored communities for centuries. It becomes impossible to think rightly, to have a good self-esteem, to do the positive things that everyone wants to do when we're in our right minds. It's a system that puts you out of your right mind. It makes you crazy. So we have to understand this. We have to understand the need for there to be an overturning of systems of oppression that make people crazy. And the person who is shackled and chained needs somebody who's liberated and free to unshackle and unchain them. Now, in many cases, that was one African in the hold of a slave ship who chiseled away at the chains and broke the fetters and became free and then freed others. And then in a chain reaction, no pun intended, released everyone. And then there was a rebellion and people tried to get back to their native land. Okay, it can be from the persons who themselves are being troubled and oppressed, but very often it must come from the people who are outside of that system of oppression, who are enjoying the benefits, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether desiring so or not, the benefits of living in that. Persons who are not afflicted have to help those who are. It's a responsibility. It's a duty. It's incumbent upon us. So, when Charles Merrifield got up and he spoke about the Valentine gifts that he's selling, I was thinking, Charles, say, it's fair trade. I mean, it seems like a little thing. We like candy. Well, when you look at what fueled the slave trade, sugar, rum, cotton, it was economic. And, sugar is an enormous economic driving impulse. Everybody wants a sweet. Everybody wants some dessert. But a lot of times to enjoy that really means that you're helping the oppression of people. Fair trade is one of the ways that we knock down racial injustice because it gets at the source of racial injustice, which very often is economic advantage. So Charles Merrifield has a mission here to overthrow an institution of evil and to support an institution of goodness. This church is supported by fair trade chocolates being marketed in our lobby. It's actually a blow against oppression. And wherever you shop, you'll see that more and more with coffee and chocolate and other things, there's an appeal to people. Understand that you are spending your dollars, and you're spending your dollars in ways that may be perpetuating oppression and misery, or you can choose to spend your dollars in ways that liberate and give dignity and return back to people what is rightfully theirs. So I say that things are much better, and they are. I wanted to emphasize that things are much better because of struggle. Things didn't get better just because human nature is good. Human nature may be good, but it can also be corrupted, and evil can become entrenched. So I want to read a quote. It's one that's in our hymnal. Practically, it could be something that I've memorized, but not quite. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing ground. Who said this? I'll read on. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Do you recognize that? Frederick Douglass, from his autobiography. Frederick Douglass had to literally fight to get free of his slave master. He was a very physically able man and a very determined man, and he escaped more than once only to be forcibly returned to slavery. And his slave master, his quote-unquote owner, hired a really powerful person who was reputed to be able to break the will of the most recalcitrant and rebellious slaves. And these two men were pitted together in physical fight, day after day, week after week, until finally Frederick Douglass beat him so severely in physical combat that the man said, I back off. And at that point, when Douglass escaped, he was not troubled anymore. But look at the struggle that was involved in that. People are struggling in that way today, but in more subtle ways. I don't know how familiar everybody is with the idea of the Princess and the Pea, that fairy tale. It has an enduring currency in the world of imagination, I think in part because it talks truth about the evolution of our spirits. Now, I want to add something here. It has lasting currency, but that's separate from the ridiculous portrait of hyperstasia being a feminine attribute that's ideal. The princess, the story, if she lies on a mattress and doesn't feel the pea underneath the mattress, she's not a real princess. And the prince would only marry the princess who had like 100 mattresses stacked up in one tiny little pea. And from a feminist angle, we could really criticize this, Okay, I'm not going at it from that angle. I'm going at it from the angle that the more refined we are, the more intolerable injustice is to us. And that the injustices that were countenanced only 100 or 200 years ago in this nation it's just inconceivable that today we would countenance, public lynchings, which were so much a fixture of the antebellum South and all over this country, actually. So I'm talking about that the more refined a culture becomes, the more refined an individual becomes, the more intolerable injustice is, even in its subtle forms, even when it's not grossly reprehensible. It's just intolerable still. And I think that we have come to that stage where, there's a lot of freedom. There's a lot of lip service given to justice. But there's still a lot lacking. I want to talk a little bit about restorative justice and put it in the context of ideas that are associated with it, like distributive justice, retributive justice, transformative justice. The idea with restorative justice is that it imbibes a lot from systems theory, that when there is injustice, those who are victimized suffer, and those who victimize suffer. And that the parties both need to be involved in therapy to dismantle a system that is injurious to all parties. This is distinct from, you could say retributive justice also has the idea that by visiting retribution on the criminal, you are in some way lifting up and helping the victim. But it doesn't quite go so far as this idea that you want to restore to the victimizers as well as to the victims their humanity, because in becoming a slave owner or a rapist or a murderer or a thief, we diminish our humanity so severely that we are in desperate need of healing, not to make small the terrible price that's paid by those who are victimized. Now, there's no way I could possibly share with you, nor I think would I want to share with you, all the things that I encountered in researching this talk. I read a book that I have on order with the library now. It's called The Empire of Necessity. The library doesn't have it yet because it's brand new, so I sat in Barnes & Noble and I read the book. And it talks about a failed attempt of a group of Africans who were enslaved to get back to Africa. They basically mutinied against the crew. They killed many members of the crew. They retained a navigator and the captain and a few others that were essential to get them back to Africa. And when you hear, when you read, when you actually have to confront the horrors of the oppression of slavery, it's just unspeakably bad. Unspeakably bad. That may be all I want to say about that. One of the things that I learned in reading that book is that a very large percentage of Africans who were brought here as slaves were literate people. They could read and write. They were polyglottal. That means they spoke several different languages, maybe sub-Saharan African languages, Arabic, and European languages as well. And they were able to write, and they were very involved in legalistic evaluation of systems of slavery. And they encountered this enslavement that they were forced into by the Europeans as something that was just totally unacceptable. Whereas they were happy and comfortable with certain forms of slavery that they had known, where a slave could become the governor of a province, or the wealthiest person in town, because slaves were not looked at as property, as subhuman beings. So I didn't know how many literate Africans came over. People who could read and write and who had very sophisticated ideas of government and culture. So this is a very interesting book, very, very interesting book. But I want to talk a little bit about the cost to the victimizers. And maybe this is indulging my great interest in life, which is spiritual evolution and transformation of consciousness and altered states of consciousness, higher states of consciousness, enlightenment, okay. But one of the costs to the criminals, and I think it's a crude but apt metaphor to say that the incursions of Europeans into Africa, Asia, and America were a form of felony, a kind of social felony. Oh, yesterday I was at the meeting at Sunflower Community Action. A police officer, one of the leading police officers in Wichita, was speaking about, well, if you want to bring about restorative justice, that's fine and good, but when you have felons, you can't just open your doors to let them come in and behave in your house, because they're felons, they're dangerous. And I was thinking, but didn't say because I didn't think it would be helpful. When Africans or African Americans think about the European powers, very often they think about them as felonious, thieves, brigands, pirates, terrorists. Oh, it's a different point of view. If for generations your family has lived under this oppression, well, when I hear about felons, I think about, the apartheid governments, Jim Crow system. And I see the systems theory, how when you act in that way towards people, you perpetuate that kind of activity in your society, and it will never stop until you become well enough to see the gross error, the real evil of that system that you yourself have authored. So let me get to the point here. In somebody who's interested in enlightenment, as I am, I think about how when you have a system of prosperity that's based on deceit and iniquity, it disposes the people who propound and prosper from that system to adopt religions and spiritual practices that are inauthentic, not genuine. The pretense of being religious or the pretense of being spiritual, when it's completely vacant of any genuine seeking after higher truth. But really, it's just embedded in the idea that I can whitewash, again, no pun intended, I can whitewash my behavior by the cloak of religiosity and sanctity and such. So we have, during the Third Reich, for instance, the church was complicit with the Nazis. It's been documented. It's really well known. There's a sentiment that's hostile to religious ideation, religious speech. Why is it? It's because people have seen religion so often associated with the most criminal and most reprehensible behavior among humans. So I have a quote from Frederick Douglass again. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of the land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. Again, there's a different perspective. Who feels it knows it? Black people have historically felt. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. And this religiosity that you're trying to visit on us is fake. I don't buy it. Now, does that mean that there is no merit to the religious project, to the spiritual project? This is the risk that cultures that perpetuate deceit and iniquity and prosper as a result of it. This is the risk that culture runs. To lose a sense of the vital need for a spiritual, religious project in human culture. It's an aspect of our lives that's essential. I go back to Andretti Smith. She can live on the streets of Calcutta or Delhi among the homeless and make friendship. You can go to her Facebook page and see what she's doing. She can do this perhaps for 10 days or 20, but at a certain point she has to take a break, and for 10 days. Okay. She is able to sustain sanity and healthy decision-making for some time. But then, what does she need? Spiritual practice, mindfulness, centering, meditation, prayer. She needs some respite. She needs some coherency. She needs a sense of human dignity and love. So, a prominent loss for the Western world, which has engaged in so much genocide and so much oppression, appropriation of people's lands and wealth around the world. A prominent loss is a loss of the grasp of prophetic religion, and in its place, the adoption of cheating religion. Just a pretense, an empty show, a hypocritical display. And it makes for a society that's not responsibly going into the future. Now, there is a lot afoot to change this. And I want to wind up by talking a little bit practically about something this church is involved in. That's why I was at Sunflower Community Action yesterday. We're giving our first plate each month to Sunflower Community Action. Sunflower Community Action has been and will be active in Wichita and around the nation as well to make sure that democracy flourishes, justice flourishes. Yesterday we were talking about Ban the Box. Ban the Box is a program that's been adopted in many, many states and in many, many cities around the country. Lewis is here. You can speak with him about details later. But the idea is that when you go for a job application, one of the things on that application is, have you ever been convicted of a crime? And, you know, a lot of times the employer just kind of looks at the face, if it is a face that looks like mine, skips down to the box, and if the check is yes, then the question is, oh, well, what was it? I mean, we can't hire you, but what was it? We have a system in place now that perpetuates injustice because you have a nation of people, a group of people, people of color, who were stolen from their homeland, stolen from their culture, and put into a situation where their family was disrupted, their language was taken from them, their culture, their religion, etc., and then placed in ghettos, in confinement, and enslaved. And then you have a situation where, without any other means for survival, people do things that are illegal. Well, it was illegal to practically walk down the street if you were a person of color. It was illegal to own property. It was illegal to speak a language that wasn't English, etc., etc. So you unnecessarily engage in illegal activities. And then you get branded and stigmatized. You are dangerous, you are unacceptable, you are unemployable. What does this mean to a people? It means perpetual enslavement. So what Ban the Box is talking about is getting rid of that box. That when you go for a job application, you present a resume and you present yourself. And you are evaluated on the basis of your resume and on the basis of your ability to do that job well. Now, there are fine points. Obviously, we want to do background checks if the person's criminal record includes molestation of children and they're going to apply for a job working with children, you have to field that kind of thing. The ban the box that has been brought forward and ratified in municipalities and states around the nation takes into account the need to have background checks and to make sure that people are safe. But it takes into account the more important need to make it possible for people whose ancestors, immediate and more further back in their history, who have been brutalized, oppressed, cheated, and have no basis to go forward except the restorative justice action of people who are not in that situation. We are people who are not in that situation. That's why we're gathered here today of our free will to entertain ideas of making a better and more just world. We're free to do that. Somebody who's grown up without sufficient food to eat, without a good school to go to. It was Marcia Diggs who was talking about one of the students in her class, an African-American boy, on one of the coldest days this winter, coming to school in shorts, and she thought, what a fashion statement. That is really not smart. And so she took him aside and said, come on. And then she learned he didn't have any long pants. He didn't have any warm clothing. People who are in these situations are in desperate situations. They've reached that point that Andretti Smith talks about, where you can't make good decisions anymore. You don't know what you should do. You're desperate. If we don't do things to overturn this, well, it redounds on us too. Because the thief who's desperate is not thinking about your welfare anymore. If you're not thinking about the thief's welfare, you're not thinking about your own. Because the thief is likely to break and enter your house. Or the person who's become so crazy because of being brutalized, that person is now thinking of brutalizing you. I mean, these are not the highest reasons to wish to extirpate evil from the land, but they're practical and they're real. If we don't extirpate evil, evil may extirpate us. I want to finish with an anecdote from my life. I went to a health fair in Brooklyn, New York, where I'm from. It was held in an armory, and it was mostly African Americans who went. Lots of guys with dreadlocks. I had dreadlocks at the time. And dashikis and jalebis and all sorts of African garb and African names. And it was a health fair. It was about healing. And there was a little booth set up by two Hindu monks. And they were wearing the robes, and they had their white faces and their bright orange robes, and they set up their table. And they were looking at the group of people, and they were not selling any books, and people were not approaching their table, and I was looking at them, and I was watching, and I was a little amused. And at a certain point, there was a live performance of jazz, and it was kind of third-stream jazz. And the players were making sounds that were so cacophonous, and that were so strange to these two guys' ears that I watched their faces. They began to look at each other like, what are we doing here? These people are out of their minds. And they started to pack up and they left. What they were hearing, I heard it too. I heard a sound of like cattle being driven off a cliff to their death below. I mean, the music was expressing the anguish in the DNA of people whose ancestors were stripped from their homes, whose culture and religion and names and language and associates and family members were all taken from them. That's what they were hearing. Because that's what the creative artists in the community that I am a member of, I'm a member of many communities, that's what they could remember. That's what's eating their lunch. We have to do what Andretti Smith has done. We have to do what Martin Luther King did. We have to do the work of being with the other and letting ourselves know what the other is experiencing. Because when we make kinship with the other, we understand how to help. And until we understand how to help each other, we are no help to ourselves in reality. Because we either have inherited an inauthentic narrative about reality, and for me, the top rubric of that is an inauthentic spiritual identity. Who I am and what the significance of my life is. And if your religiosity or spirituality can countenance slavery and oppression and genocide, what kind of human being have you become? And what is your destiny? So until we learn to help ourselves, to help others, we haven't learned how to help ourselves. That's why I say Black history is world history. Black History Month is the history of the world. Jazz, pop music. The Beatles, they were listening to the Ronettes and Chuck Berry. There's some vibrancy when people get together. Allen Ginsberg famously said that Beatles have taught white folks how to shake their booty again. There's a vitality. There's something beautiful in the symbiont relationship between humans of every color and every background. We have to love each other. We have to care for each other. If we don't, we lose a grip on who we are. We lose a grip on ourselves. Pay attention to this Ban the Box initiative that Sunflower is pushing to get our political representatives to do something about. It's not just a political thing. It's an economic thing. But it's a social thing. It's something to make our city safer, more humane, more real in terms of its lip service or dedication to goodness and humanitarian values. Like I said, there's so much that I could say that I don't wish to say, in part because it's too disturbing. But the most important thing is, I believe, I know, and I hope that you believe and know, we can make it a better world. We can change the world. We can overthrow racial, economic injustice. All systems of injustice can be overthrown, but it begins with the belief that it can happen. Thank you very much.